I'm really glad to be here, and I'll be talking about prototyping. The slideshow isn't that good looking, so I guess I'll prototype it in a way, so I'll just get on with it. I want special thanks to Rami Ismail for bringing me here, sponsoring this talk, and Alessandra, of course, and the control crew, everyone. So thanks, everyone. And so disclaimer about the talk. So I want to ask, who are programmers here? Who are artists here? Producers? Designers, biz dev. Okay, cool. So it's gonna be a mix of technical stuff and not so technical stuff. So we're gonna say straight to it. So a little bit about me. I'm a self-taught developer for like over 6 years, 7 years with Unreal. I came across Unreal when it was free in 2015. I like free stuff, so I was like, I'm gonna get this free thing, and I got this free thing, and now it's my career. So it's a bit of an odd thing. I'm also a film school dropout, participated in over a little bit of 15 game jams, and I have a hard time releasing games, which I'll be talking about right now. I'm also a technical lead on a game called Soar right now, which is a VR flying game, and you're probably wondering, VR and flying, that's going to cause a lot of motion sickness, and we're going to be talking about that in a bit as well. We also recently signed a publisher with it. Recently, so woohoo, but of course I can't announce who yet, and of course I can't show it yet. I worked in many different teams. I started solo, worked with a big team, small team, whatever, and also wore many hats. Did biz dev, did a bunch of design, all that sort of stuff. So that's me. I forgot to play one of the games I made, and it's just a cool, it's basically Mirror's Edge on psychedelics. That's the way I'd like to describe it. And of course, a bunch of on the A project. So that's me. That's Lee. What is prototyping? Prototyping is basically prototyping a game idea rapidly. Thank you for coming. I came all the way here just to say that joke. OK, cool. Anyway, no, but seriously, it's essentially taking the idea, it's essentially transitioning from an ideation stage to an execution stage. And we're not to confuse it with prototype, because a prototype is a game state that is a prequel of a vertical slice and a sequel to an ideation, right? But prototyping is a tool that happens literally all the time throughout production. At the beginning of the production, mid-production, and end of production. Hopefully you won't do that at end of production because you need to lock down things at the end of production. And you're not just prototyping the core game loop. You're not prototyping just the fun. You're prototyping a lot of the stuff that's going on, components, different components, dialogue systems, parallax effects, whatever. It could be anything. But essentially, I forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, but like when it comes to the prototype as a state, Rami released recently a new edition for the newsletter talking about the prototypes and vertical slice, and that gives a much better example. But just to establish a common lingo, prototyping is like a tool, is a mechanism that you do all the time, essentially. Oh, not all the time, but you know. So I have a personal prototyping cycle, and let's say it's a rule of thumb, but it's your own thumb. So you have to sort of create it. But you have to sort of create your own prototyping cycle. But the thing is with the prototyping, it's a very isolated mechanism, because even though you're doing it with a bunch of people, imagine if you're cutting the chicken. You're cutting the chicken by yourself. No one else is helping you cutting the chicken. So you're cutting the chicken and then throwing that chicken to whatever, the pot or whatever. And I like to sort of do a timeline calculation. So if something takes 3 days to make, I would check in every end of the day just to see if we're still on the timeline. And that's the ideal way of doing it. So you get a prompt, and that prompt could be a document from the lead. It could be your own idea. It could be a game jam theme. It could be any of that. It's a prompt you start working with, and then you execute on that. Of course, you review it and validate it, and then hopefully you approve it and then merge it into the main game. Hopefully. But that doesn't really usually what happens. So what happens usually is you go do some more work, and with more work, things started to get very interesting, because with that experimentation happening, with those prototyping happening, a lot of those eureka moments or just finding the cool thing about it. But this is where things get double-edged sword in that sense. So you get to do more work on it, and then you find out this is pretty cool, but it's something quite different from what you're building so far. And then you find out OK, I'm going to get some work done on it, and then I'm going to spend a few days on it, and a few days after, you realize that, oh, no, I don't like that. This is not really what I want. So what you do instead is you put more hours into it, and you realize, oh, my God, this is actually becoming something really interesting. And so you put more days and more hours on it until you realize that you've lost basically what you're doing, and you realize that, oh, my God, I hate this game. So you end up losing a lot of money. You basically, publishers don't talk to you anymore. Well, of course not, but you basically run out of resources, and this is what you end up with. But sorry. So that's what I'll be talking about right now. I'll be showing you just the different ways I do in order to improve the prototyping pace, and it's a bunch of management and a bunch of technical stuff. And yeah, I'll be going into that. Hopefully, it'll improve the prototyping pace, if that makes sense, and lessens the risks of, not dealing with this, with things being on fire. So I'm going to go super detailed right now. I'm going super micro level, but bear with me. I'll go high level again, because I want to get this concept out of the way, or take this concept. Sorry. So on Site Unreal, there is something called data assets. It's very similar to data spreadsheets or data tables. But the thing is with data assets is that it's a class that holds all the variables, but you can swap in the instance of the class in real time or in preview the editor. So one thing I've set up right now, very quickly right now here, is I've set up a data asset class with a bunch of stuff happening: character speed, gravity strength, character acceleration, jumping strength over here, air resistance, so on. And what you can do from that is that you can create an instance of it, and then you can have a bulk of parameters of it in one file. And you can also create another bulk or another set. So those are two different sets of the same variables that you can bind inside the character class, which is here. And right now, you're going to look at spaghetti code, but that's why it's prototype, yeah. So the cool thing about this is that the beautiful thing about this is that you can swap in right before you play. So if I play here and I just go move around and blah, 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 and then I exit, I'm like, OK, I don't like that, but I have a bulk of parameters I want to change. You go to player settings 2, for example, the other instance, and then it becomes completely different to play. And it's the idea of swapping a bulk of settings right after each other that gives you a feel of where things are going. And I want to take this, and right now we're taking this concept to apply it a little bit on a higher level. And so going back to, where am I? OK. Going back to here. So, OK. So we're taking this method and scoping it out. Something that I do when I'm prototyping is use a programming best practice, which is basically whenever you want to get a feature in, you basically create a branch, and that branch has a bunch of code that you have, and then you validate it with a team, you review it, yada yada, and then you approve it, and then you merge it back to main. Now you can take this concept and do what we're basically doing right now, which is basically every time we think that the prototype or we are at a place where we're satisfied with it, we checkpoint it in the actual source control. So it doesn't have to be on remote source control, on the remote repository, but it can be just on your local. But the idea is to checkpoint between every bulk of commits. Because the reason why you do that is when you start adding more and more features, you realize that, OK, I'm adding more on top. I'm diluting the original build that you found pretty good. And the reason why you want to do that is you open the 3 instances at the same time, or it doesn't have to be at the same time, but it can be back-to-back, and you play the first checkpoint, and then you play the second checkpoint, and then you play the third checkpoint. And the first checkpoint can have future 1, the second checkpoint can have future 1 and 2, cool ones, and the third checkpoint can have all 3 futures. And the reason for that is when you get to test all 3 right after each other, you get to see where is the conversion loss, if that makes sense. So what I mean by conversion loss is basically whenever you add more stuff to something that you think is good enough, there is a double-edged sword of I'm adding value, but I'm also losing the original cool thing that you've added, right? And it's a very simple concept of it's like a yellow circle on a white background. You know, if you have one yellow circle, if you have one yellow circle by itself, you won't be able to detect the difference. But if you have slightly different yellow shades of circles on that same wall, you'll be able to see the difference. It's that same concept, and that's what happened with Cycloverse City, the game that I used to work on. Well, it's a solo game that I used to work on. So basically, what I did is I implemented something called a freeze frame in air. So when you're running and you're falling at a high enough speed, if you're falling too fast, the game will pause for a moment for you, so you can able to aim again and see where you want to go, because you can also jump in midair. And this is what's basically happening. Here, you're seeing the differences between what it's like to play the game without freeze frame and what it's like to play the game with freeze frame. And it's just one of those many things that I've adapted this method in order to test things out, basically. So continuing off that, this is very similar to something that we did recently with Soar. And like I said, Soar is a VR flying game, and there's obviously a lot of potential motion sickness, which we think that is getting to the point that it's negligible. So most of our testers are not complaining about motion sickness. But one of the issues with, or one of the problems that we had with Soar is that the fact that we need to prototype something and then we have to send it to a bunch of testers to see if there's motion sickness or not. And motion sickness is not an objective, it's not an objective degree that you can measure if this is something too good or something too bad, right? It's a very subjective thing that becomes, you know, within. I don't know, it's hard to explain. But basically we use that. And what we did is that we send a build for the pool of the testers, and they would be like, oh, this is motion sicky, this is not, this is causing me nausea, this is not. And we have a spreadsheet of that. But then we realized, oh my God, it's taking forever to know whether what we're building, which is just very minor values between the acceleration and the gravity and so on, is taking forever to see if this is good enough or not. Instead, what we did is, with our coworker virtually, without my coworkers virtual, we'd be like, okay, I've sent you all the builds of, we've checkpointed all the good spots of where the character settings are good, and I'll play them back to back. And then you look at the guy while playing the game, and you look at them and be like, are you good, are you not? And then sometimes they're really good, they're fine, they're like, oh my God, this is not causing me motion sickness. And sometimes they're like, no, I don't want to play anymore. And what we did is that we used the least motion sicky, the least build that caused motion sickness, and used that as a benchmark. We know that still caused motion sickness, but we still use that as a benchmark to evaluate other builds that we can test now way faster than our previous method. So another thing that I like to do when I'm prototyping is, this is not mine, but I have something like that at home. And it's basically using macro keyboards to basically customize the values or adjust the values in real time in game. So what you can do is that you can get the input of those, especially the knobs and the wheels. The knobs and the wheels are very, very useful. So you can build your own custom one, or you can order one online or whatever, and you combine them inside, let's say, Unreal, and then you can start playing with the gravity, how strong you want it in game. Or you can also do that with any other parameter, basically. As long as you're able to adjust the input, you can also do that in real time. So it became very useful to me when I started to do a lot of 3C prototyping, which is character camera control stuff. OK, I think I've missed a slide, but I don't know where it's gone. But whatever. OK, cool, whatever. So one thing about visual scripting is that it's amazing for prototyping. It's wonderful. Like, as much as we like to optimize things and make it as good as, or as fancy or as efficient as it can be, visual scripting is super, super useful when you're prototype, because you can just create a lot of things super fast instead of having multiple lines of code over a span of like an hour compared to, let's say, 10 minutes. Usually that's the conversion, at least my experience in. But of course, the drawback of that is that you've got spaghetti code, because basically when you have so much stuff to prototype, You start having nodes here, bulk of node there, and that's fine. That's all right until you prove your concept. So it's really not something to worry about. Maybe your technical lead or you yourself are going to be like, oh my god, I hate this, but it's fine. It's part of the process. And one thing to improve your blueprints is you use something called electronic nodes and auto-size comments. And there's another few plugins that I wanted to mention here that I use personally, but I did not put them here. But it's basically you put the node right next to each other, and they automatically connect. And it's very, very useful. And also with Unreal, you can use JetBrains, obviously, plus using a ReSharper plugin on that, and that helps a ton in that stuff. So another thing I do while prototyping, whenever I start a new project, or even in the middle of the production, I sort of have this started content that, similar to what Unreal has as started content. Unreal has a started content whenever you build a project. They have a bunch of meshes, they have a bunch of materials, they have a bunch of VFX, and so on. And that's the same with me. And you can also do that with yourself. And it's very, very useful because immediately you have access to all the stuff that you've built before without worrying too much about, oh, I have to open this project and put it back here and yada, yada. So things like animation blueprints that you can use, like previous locomotion graphs and so on. Function libraries, of course, they're very useful. I have my own VR started content for that because there's a ton of separate things that comes to that. And one important thing to note is that third-party plugins are super useful. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, but it's an asset flip. Great, that's fine. As long as you can prototype it super fast and you can validate that it's good enough, it's fine. You'll get rid of the bloat in mid-production or after you proof of concept. So nothing to worry too much about. And so one thing I want to get into is something very interesting because my headset is over there, my VR headset. But I do want to show how difficult it is compared to PC to prototype a game in VR. And I may have forgotten my headset. OK, whatever. So with VR prototyping, and I've been doing VR prototyping for a little bit over a year now, and it's literally a headache. Like, it can cause headache while you're just prototyping just because of the nature of it. And the reason for that is because imagine this. You have to, first of all, enter Erlink or whatever desktop virtual you have to enter in your VR. Then you have to wear the headset. And then you have to make sure that Unreal is working properly with it. And then you have to make sure that the cable is working with it. And then you can press play. And then you can get your controllers and actually test the thing that you've tested. So that took literally maybe 30 seconds a minute. And then multiply that over multiple times over the day. And that becomes a good amount of time. So that's like, what, an hour of just, like, oh my god, why is VR not working well, and so on. So I have a few things that I do in order to make VR prototyping better, and hopefully it'll be useful for you in one way or another. So basically, I put the headset on a mannequin head, because if you put that on a mannequin head, it'll automatically detect it at the head, and there's not going to be any issues in sort of tracking where things are going. It's very useful when you just want to prototype basic stuff, UI interactions or anything like that. And it helps a lot when you also create controls that simulate those VR controls. You can do it with a keyboard and a mouse. So like for mouse can sort of simulate how the camera is looking. And then you can just use the macro keyboard that I mentioned before, or the keyboard itself to just simulate those controls. Another thing that I do is I implement hand tracking right from the get-go. Like, even though you might not have hand tracking, or even though hand tracking is a little bit difficult, the beautiful thing about hand tracking is that you can put, especially on the Quest 2, you can put it on the Quest 2, and then bam, you don't have to see like, oh my god, where's my controls? Oh shit, what's that? Oh, I just dropped it or something, right? You just grab it right from the, you just use your hands right from the get-go. So one thing I'm doing recently, that I've been doing not recently, but in the past year or so, is I've created a small circle of friends where we are sort of sharing our prototypes and sharing the source code of that and playing each other's prototypes and validating whether this is good or this is not. I like this, I don't like that. And the beautiful thing about this is that it's a very give and take sort of process just by the nature of it, because while you're seeing how they're prototyping the game, you can also see the source code of that and see if it's if something you can learn from. And also you're giving feedback that is needed from the person who prototyped the game, because especially with solo developers, it's hard to get that validation right from the get-go because they don't have other team members to see whether this prototype is good enough or not to continue and invest your time in that. So that's something we've been doing, and I'm looking to create that into a bigger community. So I'm looking to sort of create more of a bigger community on that on Discord and see if this is going to work on a not so macro scale, but separated macro scales, if that makes sense. So hit me up if you're interested and you want to join. I just want to make sure what. Oh. OK, so here's a bit of a thing that you can do that I do as well when I prototype. And it doesn't have to apply to you, but you can also find all sorts of tricks like that in order to make your prototyping process faster. So when you're in this zone where you get into this zone of working really well and super focused, you become so focused that any other person can come to you and be like, hey, the house is fire, and you're going to be like, OK, cool, and then you can just continue working. That kind of zone is very useful with what I do is when I change the time zone of my PC to an hour more or 2 hours more. Maybe 2 hours more if the deadline is way too close. And the reason why I do that is because when the time zone is 1 hour close, you trick your brain to be like, oh, wow, we're way closer to the deadline than we thought. And then you start panicking and working faster. And it's very weird. It's really hard to explain. But when you're in the zone, you actually get tricked into it. So that's one thing you can do, and that's a bunch of things that, yeah. So I want to go back to a little bit to less tech and more about production stuff. I want to ask something. How many times have you made a game jam and it started from one idea on paper, and then it morphed into a completely different thing at the end of the game jam? How many people have experienced that? OK, awesome. That's great. So this is beautiful because, in a way, it opens up a lot of ways to experiment, to see different experimentations, different things that you can do. However, at the same time, the issue is that in a production prototyping, as we call it, production prototyping, that becomes quite dangerous because once you want to prototype an orange, you end up with an elephant at the end. And that's fine, but sometimes that elephant cannot be as valuable as you thought. So one thing we're sort of, this is a very fancy word of scope prototyping. I just merged scope and prototype and called it a day. But it's basically just the essence of using the deadline of game jam to sort of track your time, to track how you're prototyping without risking the potential output of your own resources or the team's resources. So you can also still be able to pay the bills and so on. And it's something that we've been thinking about recently, how we can scope prototype in a way where we can always fit prototyping throughout the full production without risking too much the release of the game itself. And yeah, I think that was a bit of a short talk. Yeah, thank you for coming to this talk. If you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, we have some time for questions if anybody would like to ask one. Don't be shy. Oh, this one.
So with VR development,
Yeah.
Especially with the Quest, you have the option to use like a link cable or go over something like Virtual Desktop or Oculus Link. What would you personally recommend in that regards? Because some are more fidgety than others.
Yeah, so you're asking if what do you recommend doing if you're using Quest 2 and you're using AirLink or the Rift Link, a cable,
Yeah.
in order to. So that's one of the things about VR prototyping that takes a little bit of time because that cable sometimes cannot be working properly or the Wi-Fi is not fast enough sometimes to test things out. So what I do is just live with it because that's sort of the reality of how things go in VR prototyping, especially with the Quest 2. I do a few things. For example, I keep in the virtual desktop, so I try to work within the virtual desktop. So I keep the Quest 2 on, and work within that environment, so I don't have to detach it and attach it every single time, or risk removing the cable in one way or another. There's also a lot of third-party cables that sort of have a strengthened ends for the Quest 2 that will help in just not having that issue going on. So yeah, that's sort of the reality of VR type.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Because I have this really cool microphone thing that I can now throw at you. If you have a question, I really want to try it, so we need another question. Oh, come on. Well, I have one question, actually.
Yeah.
You mentioned game jams quite a lot. And
What's that?
You mentioned game jams quite a lot.
Yeah.
How do you still participate in game jams quite frequently?
If I'm feeling healthy.
Okay. If you're feeling healthy. Right.
Yeah, like I think after doing like more than 15 games at this point, it's like my body is screaming, please stop, please. Like, and it's sort of in a way affected the way I do production as well. It's like, oh, I can do a game jam sprint on this little thing that I need to do, and then I regret it 48 hours later because, yeah. But it's something I would love to still do once things get a little bit less hectic than it is right now. But yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, yes.
Okay, that works, kind of.
Hey.
So I have a little question regarding the game jam thing.
Yeah.
Like, I kind of feel like it's not that healthy to do
Right.
consistently.
It is not.
So I was wondering what you would feel would be a more healthy way to engage with the concept of game jams, since, full 24 hours and then like kind of doing a crunch during that time is quite obviously not that great.
Exactly.
So what would you recommend of like keeping that time limit maybe, but doing it in a different way that you don't exhaust yourself and pressure yourself into working somehow?
Yeah, that's a good question because it can sort of lead to a lot of sort of paths in order to deal with that. Like, game jam is great in a way because it teaches you that idea of prototyping something based on a certain theme that you have to follow and you have to stick and you have to deliver by the end. However, like you said, like 48 hours is a lot. 72 hours is maybe not that much, but it's the concept of well, then when that becomes an issue, that becomes where the reality hits. Where okay, now you have to give time for developers to do their job, and you have to scope things down possibly, and you have to cut down on some features. So it's sort of, or you can hire more developers and do more of the same thing. But yeah, like the reality is the best way not to do that is to not to do that. Just to extend the time instead, extend the deadlines, and budget. Of course, do the budgeting of whatever game that you're working on to a point that it has that buffer of, okay, I can extend my deadline 6 months later, or not 6 months later, but 3 months later or something like that. But it has that buffer that you can sustain yourself. But yeah.
Oh, there's a question. Oh, here.
Sorry, it wasn't hard to.
This is super cool, the little box.
I can throw it to you.
Yeah, this is the first thing I've ever seen it.
This is not meant in a harsh way, but you seem like a pretty chaotic person.
Yeah, I am.
Very chaotic, I might say. And I am such a person as well.
Amazing.
How do you keep it focused, especially for the people around you? Because I think you're not always working as a one-person team.
No, I've definitely had experience of working by myself alone. But it's a good question because by nature, like you said, like we're both chaotic. It's hard to have that. Basically, at least what I do for myself is I have those deep sessions of, okay, no interruptions. I play some white noise in the background, just focus hour and a half. But I don't really like focus 100%. I just look at some phone and like get distracted in that sense. But what you can do a lot for your team is, at least what I'm doing right now, is have that constant. This is going to be silly to say, but Jira.
What?
Jira.
Jira.
Yeah, just keep everything logged in and documented properly on Jira, just so that people can understand, okay, you're chaotic, but at least we know what's happening on your end. So it's definitely a tough thing to do, especially, like you said, I'm very chaotic at that.
Yeah, and is it possible for yourself to keep the bird view, or are you like, when you're taking that 1.5 hour where you put down the clock, you're hyper-focusing on one point, totally forgetting the rest of the game?
Sorry, I didn't catch that at the end.
Like, do you ever get hyper-focused, or how do you keep it clear for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what happens during that process is we have sort of milestones that we need to hit by the end of the week or 2 weeks. So we basically have mini sprints in that sense, or let's say macro game jams. Happens over like span of 1 week or 2 weeks, and it's a really focused job of getting those done. And of course, trying our best not to do everything in the last 48 hours of the milestones or the sprints. I wanted to say something, but I completely forgot. Well, that's
I love
yeah.
your energy.
But yeah, I try to follow something that advice is given by a neuroscientist, which is the brain can only sustain 3 hours of really intense zoned work every day, and we sort of have to. I'm sort of following that, and I'm doing that 1 hour and a half, separated by a few hours of leisure work, and then 1 hour and a half of a deep session. And that deep session work would consist of just purely prototyping, purely programming, no distractions sometimes. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice. There was a question back there somewhere. If you can throw it that way, this is
Yeah.
going to be. Oh,
Bam.
It worked.
Nice throw.
You mentioned the psychological tricks to make your brain work faster. What do you
Oh,
mean,
sorry, I
sir?
can't hear you properly.
You mentioned some psychological tricks to like trick your brain to work faster.
Yeah, yeah.
I've tried the one with the time.
Yeah.
I feel like my brain is too aware to get caught by
Yeah.
that because it knows like the 1 hour delay, so it just plans like
Just
an
like,
hour.
you
Do
know.
you have any other ones that you use that are kind of fun?
Sorry, what's the last part?
Do you have any other tricks that you use to trick your brain to work faster?
Not quite. This is what I'm using right now. It might be like, you know, it might be. I might be able to just call it a bluff in 1 month or whatever. But this is what I'm doing right now, and it helps really, really well. But I guess it's a very sort of personal thing that you have to sort of trick your brain in a way to do so. And it's just one way to do it, I guess.
Yeah, it's just like a really silly concept to trick your brain into just doing
Yeah.
it. So.
It's like, you don't trust anyone, not even yourself. You know that meme?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Yeah.
yeah, it's up here.
For if you suffer from some perfectionism, as a lot of people probably will,
Yeah.
how do you decide it's time to stop working on a prototype?
When I see the account, my account finance not doing so well, or not my account, like the project's finance not doing so well. At some point, we just have to stick to the reality of we really have to meet the deadline. We really have to do that because otherwise we can't pay people anymore. And when I was solo, that wasn't the case. That's why like Psychoverse City, the one with the psychedelic parkour, that was never released for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons was because of that idea of, oh, I need to get this feature, I need to get that feature in, I need to make it perfect and so nice and beautiful. But that was one of the things that, shot myself in the foot in that sense. But yeah.
All right, so these budget restrictions help you on that front.
Oh, sorry?
These budget restrictions help you on that front to keep it focused.
Yeah, exactly. Budget restrictions and contract term clauses.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's like, no, I don't want to lose everything.
Oh, this is cool. Hey, in game design, you have this principle called kill your babies, which is a very interesting term. But basically, designing, you come up with better and better and better ideas, and at some point, you have to just get to the realization that, as cool as an idea is, you sometimes have to scale back down to an idea that works.
Right.
Of course, you've run into these issues a lot with prototyping as well, because you're developing very, very fast.
Right.
How do you deal with having to face the reality of the design that I want cannot always be implemented, but the design that is possible can always be implemented?
Good question. Can you elaborate more on that?
So when you're prototyping and you're trying a lot of ideas, there's you might have an idea that works, right?
Yeah.
And that fits your target audience, but you keep trying further anyway, and then you stumble across ideas that you very much like, you as the designer, the prototyper.
Okay. Right.
But it doesn't quite fit your target audience or your game's target. How do you handle having to choose for your target audience and your game rather than the thing that you like the most?
Right. So that's a conundrum for sure, because with one of our games that I've worked on before, it was really a mix of trying to see what people really like in terms of what's selling right now, but also what we want to do. And that mix was very hard to do. So what we do, for example, with again, mentioning Psychovery City, I implemented the synthwave visual style because during that time it got very, very trendy. A lot of Steam games with synthwave theme got sold a lot. So it's making that decision whether it's basically this decision of what I'm doing that I'm pivoting to or that I'm choosing against. Is it going against the core of what I'm building? And the core of what you're building, that's another discussion, right? Is the core of what you're building gonna sell? Is there an audience for it? Is there a niche audience that can grow into something else? That's a whole different discussion for sure. But at least that's the way I sort of try to approach things in that sense.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool.
I think we
Thanks.
might be out of time for questions. So if you have any more, then I think you could be around afterwards.
What's that?
I think we might be out of time. So if they have any more questions for you, we might have to talk about that later.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. They're hiring.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
Cool.
Lee.
Thanks.
I can
Thanks,
throw
everyone.
this now, right? I can throw this now, right?
Yeah. It's awesome, isn't it?